Understanding the different types of altitude isn't just about passing a written test. It could be the difference between safely clearing a mountain pass or becoming a statistic. Weather, aircraft performance, and navigation all hinge on knowing which altitude you're actually using. So let's walk through all 6 in a way that works both in the aircraft and on the written test. At the end of this video, I'll show you how you can access the free interactive altitude trainer I've built. You'll be able to change temperature, pressure, and position of the aircraft and watch how these altitudes are affected. Let's start with what's right in front of you. Indicated altitude is what your altimeter is showing you right now. Here's how the FAA defines it. Indicated altitude is the altitude read directly from the altimeter when it's set to the current altimeter setting. This is the altitude you reference during normal operations, like flying the traffic pattern or complying with an ATC altitude assignment. But your altimeter is a mechanical instrument, and mechanical instruments are not perfect. So the next question becomes, if we removed instrument error, what would that altitude really be? That leads us to calibrated altitude. Calibrated altitude accounts for the small errors built into the instrument itself. Here's the textbook wording. Calibrated altitude is indicated altitude corrected for installation and instrument error. Now let's remove another variable, local pressure. Your altimeter works by sensing atmospheric pressure, so if we want a standard reference that works everywhere, pressure has to be standardized. That's where pressure altitude comes in. Here's the FAA definition. Pressure altitude is the altitude above the standard datum plane. You find it by setting 29.92 inches of mercury in the altimeter window. Pressure altitude is what performance charts are built on, and it's the altitude used for flight levels above 18,000 feet. But that still doesn't answer one important question. How high are you actually above sea level? That's true altitude. Here's the textbook definition. True altitude is the vertical distance of the aircraft above mean sea level, or MSL. In practical terms, it is calibrated altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. On a cold day, your altimeter overreads and you're lower than it indicates. On a hot day, it underreads and you're higher than it indicates. True altitude is what matters for terrain and obstacle clearance on a sectional chart. Now let's change the reference point completely. Instead of measuring altitude from sea level, imagine measuring it from the ground directly beneath you. That's absolute altitude. The FAA defines it this way. Absolute altitude is the vertical distance of an aircraft above the surface of the Earth, also known as AGL. This is the altitude that matters most during takeoff, landing, and low-level operations. And finally, the one that surprises people the most, density altitude. This one is different. It's not a physical height. It's a performance measurement. Here's the official definition. Density altitude is pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. As temperature increases, air density decreases, and the aircraft performs as though it were operating at a higher altitude. Humidity also reduces air density and aircraft performance, but it's not part of the standard density altitude definition or most performance charts. On a hot day at a high elevation airport, your density altitude can be thousands of feet higher than your true altitude. This is what determines takeoff distance, climb performance, and whether the aircraft can safely fly at all. So let's tie it all together. Indicated altitude is what your altimeter shows you. Calibrated altitude corrects that for instrument error. Pressure altitude puts you in the standard atmosphere. True altitude tells you how high you actually are above sea level. Absolute altitude tells you how high you are above the ground. And density altitude tells you how the airplane or aircraft is going to perform. That's a lot to keep straight. Now let me show you the free interactive tool I mentioned earlier. Here the aircraft is set to 5,000 feet MSL. You can click and drag the aircraft from left to right to see how the terrain changes your AGL altitude, and you can modify temperature and pressure to see how the altitudes change. For simplicity, it's assumed that calibrated and indicated altitude are equal. There's also a quiz to test your knowledge and a reference guide with all 6 altitude types. This tool really helps make the concepts click. Here's how you get free access. Join my Patreon by clicking Join for Free. There's a link to it in the description, and it's the first link down below. You do not have to join a paid peer to get access. Then go to the Altitude Mastery post on my Patreon. I'll also link that down below in the second link. In that post, you'll see a link directly to the tool on my website. Then it's going to ask you to allow my website to connect to your Patreon account. Once you've done that, you should be redirected to the tool, and if you're not, that's also the third link in the description. Let me know if this helps, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.